December 18th, 1944. 0647 hours. A frozen Belgian foxhole outside Bastogne. The M6A3 rocket leaves the tube with a crack that splits the morning air. 68 yards away, the shaped charge warhead slams into a Panzer IV right at the turret ring. A white flash. Small. Almost disappointing. Then the hatches blow open. Black smoke erupts from every opening, like the tank is breathing its last breath. A crew member pulls himself out, uniform on fire, rolls off the turret deck onto frozen ground screaming. Nobody else comes out. Nobody else can come out. Inside that steel coffin, a copper jet traveling at 25,000 feet per second has just turned 4 German soldiers into memory. Sergeant Jim Morrison, 23 years old. Former farm kid from Iowa stands in that foxhole with a weapon that did not exist 4 years ago. Loaded with ammunition the Germans have never seen before. His hands are shaking, not from cold. Behind the burning Panzer, 2 more tanks stop dead. Their commanders button up. One begins reversing immediately. The other searches for a threat it cannot find. 90 seconds later, Morrison fires again. The second Panzer dies silent. Engine quits. No hatches open. Just stops 85 yards from his position with something burning inside that smells like chemicals, mixed with oil, mixed with something no man should ever have to describe. The third Panzer disappears into the fog. 2 tanks. 2 rounds. 90 seconds. And the German army just learned that American infantry is no longer helpless. But 6 months earlier, none of this was possible. 6 months earlier, every American infantryman in Europe knew the same terrible truth. When German armor rolled toward your position, you had 3 options: hide, run, die. Sometimes all 3 in that exact order. Here is the problem that was killing American soldiers faster than German bullets ever could. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe had unleashed the largest ground war in human history across the fields and hedgerows of France. American infantry divisions pushed inland from Normandy, fighting through terrain that gave every advantage to defenders. And the defenders had tanks. Panzer IVs with 80 millimeters of frontal armor. Panthers with 100 millimeters. Tigers with 120 millimeters of hardened steel that could stop anything the average American foot soldier carried. The M1 Garand was the finest infantry rifle in the world. It could drop a man at 500 yards. The Browning automatic rifle could suppress a machine gun nest with sustained fire. But neither weapon could scratch the paint on a Panzer. American infantry did have one anti-tank weapon, the M1A1 Bazooka, firing a 2.36-inch rocket that could theoretically penetrate 80 millimeters of armor. Theoretically, under perfect conditions. Perfect meant hitting flat armor at exactly 90 degrees from precisely 150 yards. In combat, tanks had sloped armor moved constantly, and German crews angled their hulls because they were not stupid. Real-world penetration dropped to 60 millimeters or less. Against a Panther's frontal plate, you might as well throw rocks. Between June and December 1944, American forces reported 1,347 separate engagements where infantry encountered German armor without adequate anti-tank support. In 892 of those encounters, American casualties exceeded 40%. Tankers had a name for it: Panzer paralysis. That frozen moment when an infantryman sees 30 tons of German steel rolling toward him and realizes nothing he carries can fight back. The paralysis was not cowardice. It was mathematics. A man with a rifle against a tank is not a soldier. He is a target. In Italy, German armor dominated mountain passes too narrow for American Shermans to maneuver. Across the Pacific, infantry needed portable weapons that guaranteed kills against Japanese armor. Everywhere American soldiers fought, the same equation repeated itself. Tanks win. Infantry dies. And the brass in Washington knew that if they could not solve this equation before the push into Germany, the casualty numbers would become unsustainable. But the solution already existed. It had existed since 1888 when a chemist named Charles E. Monroe noticed something strange about explosives with hollow cavities. They focused their blast into a narrow cutting jet. The British called it the Monroe effect. By 1938, a Swiss scientist named Henry Mohaupt had refined the concept into something that could burn through armor plate, like a plasma torch through butter. The physics were elegant in their violence. Take an explosive charge. Place a cone-shaped copper liner inside it. Detonate the explosive from behind. The detonation wave collapses the copper cone inward at pressures exceeding 3 million pounds per square inch. The copper stops behaving like solid metal. It flows like liquid, forming a superheated jet that travels at 25,000 feet per second. That jet does not crack armor. It does not melt armor. It liquefies a hole straight through, sending molten copper fragments into the crew compartment at hypersonic velocity. Germany already had this technology in their Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. Britain had the HEAT. The Soviets had their RPG variants. America had the Bazooka, but had never married shaped charge technology to that weapon system effectively. The problem was engineering precision that seemed impossible under wartime conditions. Shaped charges needed exact standoff distance, the gap between the warhead and the target, to form the penetrating jet correctly. Too close, and the jet cannot form. Too far, and it disperses into nothing. The Bazooka's rocket wobbled in flight, spun unpredictably, and arrived at its target in conditions that made precise standoff distance a fantasy. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground had been trying to solve this problem for 3 years. 72 different warhead designs had failed. 72 times the math said it should work, and 72 times the copper jet dispersed or failed to form or punched a hole too shallow to matter. Then came attempt number 73. The team at Aberdeen Engineers, whose names remain classified or lost to bureaucratic indifference, made one critical change. They added a hollow steel nose cone extending 4.7 inches forward of the warhead body. Simple in concept, revolutionary in execution. When the rocket struck armor, that nose cone would crumple on impact, stopping the warhead at exactly 4.7 inches from the target surface. The perfect standoff distance. Behind that nose cone sat a copper liner machined to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch, angled at precisely 42 degrees. They had tested 73 different cone angles. 42 degrees was the optimal compromise between penetration depth and jet stability. The explosive fill was Composition B, a mixture of RDX and TNT that detonated hotter and faster than pure TNT alone. The complete round weighed 3.4 pounds, measured 19.4 inches long, diameter of 2.36 inches, identical to the standard Bazooka rocket. That last detail was everything. It meant the new ammunition fit existing launchers without a single modification. No new weapon needed. No retraining required. Just load and fire. They designated it the M6A3 high-explosive anti-tank rocket. On paper, it could penetrate 100 millimeters of homogeneous steel armor, not calculated at favorable angles, not under laboratory conditions. 100 millimeters of actual armor on actual tanks. Nobody believed it. Technical Sergeant Raymond Briggs, a veteran Bazooka instructor who had taught hundreds of soldiers how to use a weapon he privately considered useless against real armor, saw the specifications in November 1944. He later wrote that he thought it was propaganda. Same size rocket, same launcher, but suddenly penetrating 30% more armor. They figured command was lying to boost morale before the winter offensive. The proof came on November 22, 1944, at a demonstration facility near Southampton, England. Engineers placed a captured Panzer IV turret as the target, packed with sandbags to simulate crew positions. From 100 yards, a soldier fired one M6A3 round. The rocket struck the turret's frontal armor. Observers saw a small flash. No fireball, no dramatic explosion. Just a flash and a thin trail of smoke. When they walked forward to inspect the turret, silence fell across the entire group. The round had punched clean through the front armor and the rear armor. Entry hole measured 0.88 inches, roughly the diameter of a nickel. The sandbags inside had been shredded by copper fragments and steel spall. Interior surfaces showed heat scorching from temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Small hole. Catastrophic damage. Briggs wrote that the lieutenant in charge asked who wanted to volunteer to sit inside the turret for the next test shot. Nobody laughed. They got the point. Production orders went out that same day. By December 1, 1944, the first 15,000 rounds shipped to forward ammunition depots in Belgium and France. Each round came with red bands painted around the warhead and stenciled instructions that read like a promise. Heat ammunition. Penetrates 100 mm armor. Standoff required. Do not muffle nose cone. By December 15th, another 28,000 rounds reached frontline units. Soldiers who unwrapped them and saw those red bands started calling them Panzer Killers before the Germans ever did. 3 days later, the Germans attacked. December 16th, 1944. Hitler launched his last desperate gamble. 200,000 German troops and 600 tanks smashed into American lines through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge. German armored spearheads drove deep into Allied territory, counting on the same panzer paralysis that had worked for 4 years. They expected American infantry to freeze, to run, to die in their foxholes as unstoppable steel rolled over them. They did not expect Sergeant Jim Morrison. They did not expect the M6A3. And by December 20th, German commanders were sending urgent reports back through their chain of command. Something had changed. American infantry was not running anymore. American infantry was shooting back, and German tanks were burning. Between December 18th and December 31st, 1944, American bazooka teams armed with M6A3 rounds destroyed or disabled 127 German armored vehicles. 47 Panzer IVs, 31 Panthers, 8 Tigers, 22 SUG-3s assault guns, 19 half-tracks. Success rate for M6A3 engagements stood at 68%, meaning more than 2 out of every 3 rounds fired resulted in a dead enemy vehicle. Compare that to the previous M6A1 rocket's 31% success rate, and the revolution becomes clear. German radio intercepts crackled with warnings. New American anti-tank weapon. Extreme penetrating power. Increase engagement distances. Avoid close infantry contact. Watch for American soldiers carrying tube weapons. The Germans started calling them Panzer murder, Panzer Killers. And they started being very careful about where they drove their tanks. But Morrison's 2 kills outside Bastogne on that frozen December morning were only the beginning. The M6A3 had proven it could kill tanks. Now it had to survive something far more dangerous than German armor. It had to survive winter. Mass production. Logistics chains stretching across a continent. And German engineers who were already designing countermeasures to neutralize the weapon that had just changed the rules of ground warfare. In Part 2, we will see how a 3.4-pound rocket with a copper cone thinner than a pencil became the most feared infantry weapon on the Western Front, how German tank crews developed desperate countermeasures to survive it, and why the soldiers who carried these rounds into battle treated them more carefully than they treated themselves. Because what was coming next made the Battle of the Bulge look like a warm-up. 2 tanks dead in 90 seconds. That was what Sergeant Jim Morrison proved outside Bastogne on December 18, 1944. A farm kid from Iowa with a 3.4-pound rocket had just killed machines that cost the Third Reich 200,000 Reichsmarks each. The M6A3 worked. The copper jet formed. The armor failed. And for the first time in the war, German tank commanders heard something they had never heard before on their radios. Be afraid of the infantry. But killing 2 panzers in a frozen foxhole was one thing. Getting that weapon into the hands of every American soldier in Europe was something else entirely. Because the M6A3 had enemies on both sides of the Atlantic, and some of them wore American uniforms. January 3, 1945. Ordnance Corps Headquarters, Paris. Colonel Harold Gruber sits behind a desk covered in after-action reports from the Ardennes. Gruber is 51 years old. West Point class of 1916 career ordnance officer, who has spent 28 years ensuring that American ammunition works exactly the way the manual says it should. He has overseen every rocket delivered to the European theater since D-Day. He has approved every specification, signed every quality control document, and he has a problem. The M6A3 rounds are failing. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough. Field reports from the Bulge show a 12% malfunction rate. 12% means roughly 1 out of every 8 rounds either fails to detonate on impact, detonates prematurely in flight, or produces a jet that cannot penetrate the armor it was designed to kill. 12% does not sound catastrophic until you remember that the soldier firing that round is standing 70 yards from a tank that will kill him if the rocket does not kill it first. Gruber slams his palm on the desk, pulls a specific report from the stack. 3rd Armored Division, December 26th. A Bazooka team fired 3 M6A3 rounds at a Panther from 100 yards. First round hit the turret. No penetration. The crew inspected the impact point later and found the copper jet had dispersed into a spray pattern instead of forming a coherent stream. Second round detonated 2 feet before reaching the tank, triggered by a tree branch the gunner did not see. Third round hit the glasses plate and punched through. The Panther burned. But that Bazooka team had to stand exposed for 45 seconds, firing 3 rockets at a tank that was shooting back. The loader took shrapnel in his left arm. The gunner lost hearing in both ears from the Panther's return fire. 3 rounds to kill 1 tank. The specification says 1 round 1 kill. Gruber knows that specifications written in laboratories do not survive contact with Belgian winters. He calls a meeting. Every senior ordnance officer in the European theater. January 5, 1945, in a requisitioned hotel conference room that still smells like expensive French cigarettes. 14 officers, 3 civilian engineers on loan from Aberdeen Proving Ground, and 1 man. Gruber did not invite, but who shows up anyway? Captain Lawrence Chen. Chen is 34. Born in San Francisco, degree in metallurgical engineering from MIT, drafted in 1942, assigned to Aberdeen, where he spent 2 years working on shaped charge development. He is one of the engineers who designed the M6A3's copper liner, and he has been in Europe since November, traveling between frontline units, collecting data on every M6A3 round that worked and every round that did not. Chen knows what is causing the failures. He has known for 3 weeks, and what he is about to say will make Colonel Gruber furious. The colonel opens the meeting by listing the malfunction reports. 12% failure rate, unacceptable. He proposes halting M6A3 distribution until quality control can be tightened at the manufacturing plants back in the States. Pull the rounds from frontline units. Go back to the old M6A1 rockets until the new ammunition meets proper standards. The room goes quiet. Every officer knows what returning to M6A1 means. It means telling infantry that the weapon keeping them alive is being taken away. It means going back to 31% effectiveness against armor that is getting heavier every month. Chen stands up without being asked. Colonel, the failure rate is not a manufacturing problem. It is a handling problem. Gruber stares at him. Captain, you were not invited to this meeting. No, sir. But I have data you need to see. Chen opens a folder containing 78 individual failure analyses. He has physically inspected 43 malfunctioning rounds recovered from the field. Every single one showed the same pattern. Damage to the nose cone. Dents ranging from 0.2 to 0.6 inches deep, caused by rough transport, careless storage, or soldiers dropping rounds in combat conditions. The nose cone is the standoff mechanism. Crush it by a 1/4 inch, and the warhead detonates at the wrong distance from the armor surface. The jet disperses. Penetration drops from 100 millimeters to 40 or less. The M6A3 is not defective. It is fragile. And the Army is shipping it in standard ammunition crates designed for conventional rockets that do not need surgical precision to function. Gruber's response is immediate. You are telling me that we have delivered 43,000 rounds of ammunition that soldiers have to treat like glass ornaments in a combat zone. Yes, sir. And if we fix the packaging and train the troops on proper handling, the failure rate drops to under 3%. 3%. From 12 to 3. That is the difference between a weapon that works and a weapon that gets soldiers killed. Gruber does not approve Chen's proposal. Not immediately. He wants proof. He wants a formal demonstration controlled conditions with rounds transported exactly the way Chen recommends versus rounds transported the standard way. Side-by-side comparison. And he wants it done in 1 week because German armor is not going to wait for American bureaucracy to make up its mind. Chen has 7 days to prove that the most important infantry weapon in the European theater can be saved by a foam-lined box and a training pamphlet. If his demonstration fails, Gruber pulls the M6A3 from service. 43,000 rounds destroyed. Production halted. And American infantry goes back to hiding from tanks. If it succeeds, Chen has to convince not just Gruber, but every supply officer, every ammunition depot manager, every sergeant in every unit from the English Channel to the Rhine, that the way they have been handling these rounds is wrong. January 12, 1945. A frozen artillery range outside Liege, Belgium. Temperature 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the northwest at 11 miles per hour. Light snow falling, reducing visibility to 300 yards. Colonel Gruber stands with 8 senior officers behind a sandbagged observation point breath, turning to clouds in the morning air. None of them want to be here. All of them want this problem to disappear. Chen has set up 2 firing positions each 100 yards from a captured German Panther turret mounted on concrete blocks. Position A will fire rounds transported in standard ammunition crates bounced around in a truck for 60 miles over Belgian roads to simulate real supply conditions. Position B will fire rounds transported in Chen's redesigned packaging, foam-lined wooden boxes that hold 8 rounds each, cushioned individually and marked fragile nose cone handle with care. 10 rounds per position. 20 total. The results will determine whether the M6A3 lives or dies. Position A fires first. Corporal Danny Whitfield, a veteran bazooka gunner with 11 confirmed kills, loads the first standard transported round. He fires from a kneeling position. The rocket crosses 100 yards in just over half a second. Impact on the Panther turret's frontal armor. Flash. Smoke. The observers walk forward. Penetration. Clean hole through the front plate. First round works. Second round. Hit. No penetration. The entry point shows a splattered copper pattern, the telltale sign of jet dispersal. Chen marks it on his clipboard. Third round. Penetration. Fourth round. Premature detonation. The rocket explodes 40 feet before reaching the target. Whitfield flinches. That would have been his face in combat. The pattern continues. Of 10 rounds from standard packaging, 6 penetrate successfully. 2 show dispersed jets with no penetration. 1 detonates prematurely. 1 fails to detonate entirely, the fuse mechanism jammed by a hairline dent in the nose cone that nobody noticed during loading. 60% success rate. Worse than the field report suggested because these rounds only traveled 60 miles. Frontline ammunition travels 200 miles or more from depot to foxhole. Position B. Same gunner, same range, same target. Chen's packaging. First round. Penetration. Second round. Penetration. Third. Fourth. Fifth. All clean penetrations. The observers stop talking. Sixth round. Penetration. Seventh. The copper jet punches through the Panther's frontal armor and exits through the rear plate, embedding itself in the concrete block behind the turret. That is 200 millimeters of total steel penetrated by a round designed for 100. Eighth round. Penetration. Ninth. Penetration. 10th round. Whitfield fires. Impact. Penetration. The entry hole measures 0.91 inches, nearly identical to the laboratory specification. 10 for 10. Chen does not celebrate. He walks to Colonel Gruber and hands him the clipboard. Standard packaging 6 out of 10. Redesigned packaging 10 out of 10. The rounds are not defective, Colonel. The delivery system is. Gruber takes the clipboard, reads the numbers twice, looks at the Panther turret, which now has 20 impact points across its surface, 10 clean penetrations from Chen's rounds, forming an almost neat cluster on the left side. He turns to his supply officer. Redesign every ammunition crate for M6A3 rounds, Chen's specifications. I want the new packaging in production within 72 hours and distributed to every depot in the theater within 2 weeks. Then he looks at Chen. Captain, you just saved this weapon. Now go save the soldiers using it. Chen spends the next 6 weeks traveling to every infantry division in the European theater. He conducts 114 training sessions on M6A3 handling and employment. He teaches soldiers to inspect every round before loading. Check the nose cone for dents deeper than a matchbook thickness. Store rounds in sleeping bags during freezing weather because Composition B explosive becomes unreliable below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear firing lanes of any obstruction taller than 6 inches because a single tree branch can trigger premature detonation. He teaches them to aim for flat surfaces. Turret faces. Rear engine decks, hull sides, anywhere the jet can strike at close to 90 degrees. He teaches them that the official 300-yard range is a lie, and that real combat accuracy lives at 150 yards or less. Resistance comes from everywhere. Sergeants who have been fighting since North Africa and do not want a laboratory engineer telling them how to do their jobs. Supply officers who complain that foam-lined crates take up twice the space of standard packaging. Battalion commanders who think training sessions waste time that should be spent fighting. Chen answers every objection the same way. He puts a standard transported round and a Chen packaged round on a table, picks up the standard round and drops it from waist height onto frozen ground. The nose cone dents visibly. Then he hands the foam-packaged round to the nearest soldier and tells him to throw it against a wall. The round bounces off undamaged. By February 15, 1945, malfunction rates across the European theater drop from 12% to 2.8%. Success rates for M6A3 engagements climb from 68% to 79%. German armor losses to infantry weapons increase by 41% compared to January. German intelligence notices. By late February, Wehrmacht reports identify a significant improvement in American infantry anti-tank capability and recommend that all armored units adopt new defensive protocols. They begin welding track links and spare road wheels to turret sides, creating crude standoff barriers designed to detonate shaped charges before they reach the main armor. They hang metal mesh screens 6 inches in front of hull sides. They coat their tanks in mud and debris, hoping to trigger early detonation. These countermeasures work sometimes. Against the improved M6A3 rounds properly handled and accurately aimed, they fail more often than they succeed. The copper jet's extreme velocity and temperature punch through improvised armor additions that would have stopped conventional projectiles cold. But the Germans are not the only ones adapting. Across the world, in a concrete bunker on the island of Iwo Jima, Japanese engineers are studying a captured M6A3 round taken from a dead American Marine. They are dismantling the nose cone, measuring the copper liner angle, analyzing the explosive composition. And they are radioing their findings to Tokyo, where Imperial Army weapons designers are already working on countermeasures that will be waiting when American forces invade Okinawa. The M6A3 has changed the war in Europe. It has given infantry the power to kill tanks. It has turned foxholes into firing positions and foot soldiers into armored hunters. But the enemy learns. The enemy adapts. And what is coming next will test not just the weapon, but the men who carry it in ways that nobody in that frozen Belgian foxhole could have imagined. In Part 3, we will see how the M6A3 faced its greatest challenge not against German steel, but against Japanese concrete volcanic rock and tunnel networks that shaped charges were never designed to penetrate. We will meet the soldiers who improvised new tactics under fire, the engineers who modified the weapon in field conditions that would horrify any laboratory, and the terrible cost of learning what a shaped charge does to human beings in enclosed spaces. Because the war was not over, and the worst fighting was still ahead. A farm kid from Iowa killed 2 Panthers in 90 seconds. An MIT engineer saved the weapon from being pulled off the line by proving that foam padding and careful hands could turn a 12% failure rate into less than 3. By February 1945, the M6A3 had gone from a secret round nobody believed in to the most feared infantry weapon on the Western Front. German tank crews called them Panzer murder, Panzer Killers, and they changed how they fought because of it. But across the Rhine, inside bunkers where Wehrmacht intelligence officers pinned reports to walls covered in red markings, the Germans were not just afraid, they were adapting. And on the other side of the world, in tunnels carved into volcanic rock on islands most Americans had never heard of, the Japanese were preparing defenses that shaped charges were never designed to face. The weapon worked. The question now was whether it could survive what was coming next. By late February 1945, Wehrmacht intelligence had compiled a comprehensive dossier on the M6A3. They knew the warhead diameter. They knew the approximate penetration capability. They had recovered unexploded rounds from battlefields and shipped them to testing facilities in Germany, where engineers dissected them, measured the copper liner angles, analyzed the explosive composition, and reported their findings directly to Albert Speer's armaments ministry. The German response came in 3 waves. First, tactical. Armored units received orders to increase engagement distances beyond 300 yards wherever terrain permitted. Tank commanders were told to avoid narrow streets, forest roads, and any terrain where American infantry could close to bazooka range without being seen. Panzer crews began posting additional infantrymen as screens walking ahead of their vehicles, specifically to identify and kill bazooka teams before they could fire. Second, technical. German workshops began welding additional armor to their tanks at a rate that bordered on desperate. Spare track links bolted to turret sides. Road wheels hung from hull flanks. Wire mesh screens mounted 6 inches in front of side armor on brackets designed to detonate shaped charges prematurely and disperse the copper jet before it reached the main plate. The Germans called this Schürzenskirt armor, and by March 1945, nearly every operational panzer on the Western Front carried some form of improvised protection. Third, doctrinal. German armored doctrine shifted fundamentally. Before, the M6A3 panzers operated as offensive spearheads driving into enemy positions with the confidence that infantry could not hurt them. After the M6A3, German armor increasingly operated in defensive roles, firing from prepared positions at maximum range, using buildings and terrain as shields against infantry approach. The predator had become prey. The numbers showed it. In January 1945, German armored units on the Western Front launched 47 offensive operations involving 10 or more tanks. In February, that number dropped to 29. By March, it fell to 11. German tank commanders were not cowards. They were doing mathematics. Every offensive operation meant closing range with American infantry. Closing range meant entering M6A3 kill zones. Entering kill zones meant burning. Between February 1st and March 15th, 1945 American infantry units destroyed or disabled 214 German armored vehicles using M6A3 rounds. That represented 31% of all German armor losses on the Western Front during that period. Infantry, not tanks, not aircraft, not artillery, had become the single largest killer of German armor. But the M6A3's success in Europe created an unexpected crisis on the other side of the world that nobody had planned for. Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. 30,000 Marines hit the black volcanic beaches of an island 8 square miles in size, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers dug into a tunnel network that stretched for 11 miles underground. The Marines brought M6A3 rounds, expecting to use them against Japanese armor. There was almost no Japanese armor on Iwo Jima. What there was instead was concrete. Reinforced pillboxes with walls 3 feet thick. Steel doors over tunnel entrances. Firing slits cut into volcanic rock that no conventional weapon could reach. Marines tried firing M6A3 rounds at pillbox walls. The shaped charge jet penetrated concrete, beautifully punching narrow holes through 3 feet of reinforced material. But a narrow hole in a concrete wall is not the same as a narrow hole in a tank. Behind a tank's armor, there are 4 men in a confined space. Behind a pillbox wall, there is a room, sometimes a tunnel complex, sometimes nothing but empty space where the jet dissipated harmlessly. The weapon designed to kill tanks was punching holes through walls without killing the soldiers behind them. Casualty reports from the first 4 days on Iwo Jima showed that M6A3 rounds fired at fortifications achieved a destruction rate of only 14%. Compared to 79% against armor in Europe, the gap was devastating. Marines died trying to use the wrong weapon for the wrong target. And some commanders began questioning whether the M6A3 had any value in the Pacific at all. That doubt lasted exactly 9 days. February 28, 1945. Sergeant Thomas Garza, a 26-year-old former auto mechanic from El Paso, Texas, crouches behind a volcanic ridge 200 yards from a Japanese pillbox complex designated Target Baker 7. The complex contains 3 interconnected bunkers with overlapping fields of fire covering a critical approach to the base of Mount Suribachi. 2 Marine platoons have already attempted to assault Baker 7. Both were driven back with combined casualties of 31 men, 11 dead, 20 wounded. Garza has been watching Baker 7 for 6 hours. He has mapped the firing slits, counted the muzzle flashes, identified the rhythm of the Japanese machine guns. And he has noticed something. The pillboxes are connected by narrow tunnels with ventilation shafts visible on the surface. Small openings, maybe 8 inches across, covered by loose rock. Garza does not have orders to attack Baker 7. He has orders to hold his position and wait for flamethrower tanks that are not coming because 3 of the 4 assigned Shermans are disabled on the beach with broken tracks. He has 6 M6A, 3 rounds of Bazooka, his loader, PFC Miguel Rivera, and an idea that his lieutenant would call insane if Garza bothered to ask permission. He does not ask permission. Garza and Rivera crawl forward under covering fire from their squad. 150 yards. Volcanic rock tears their uniforms and skin. Japanese machine gun fire passes overhead in bursts. 100 yards. Garza can see the ventilation shafts, now dark circles against gray rock. 75 yards. He sets up behind a natural rock formation that gives him a firing angle directly into the nearest ventilation shaft. The shaft opening is 8 inches wide. The M6A3 rocket is 2.36 inches in diameter. The shot is not impossible, but it requires precision that the bazooka was never designed to deliver. Rivera loads the first round. Garza aims, fires. The rocket crosses 75 yards and strikes rock 6 inches to the left of the shaft opening. The shaped charge detonates against volcanic stone. A hole appears in the rock but does not reach the tunnel below. Garza adjusts. Rivera loads. Second round. This one enters the ventilation shaft. Garza watches the rocket disappear into the dark opening. For 2 seconds, nothing happens. Then a muffled explosion echoes from underground. Dust and smoke erupt from the shaft and from 2 other openings 30 feet away. The shaped charge detonated inside the tunnel connecting the pillboxes. The copper jet contained by rock walls instead of open air ricocheted through the confined space at hypersonic velocity. The machine gun in the nearest pillbox stops firing. Garza does not wait to confirm results. Rivera loads a third round. Garza targets a second ventilation shaft 40 feet from the first. Fires. The rocket enters clean. Another underground detonation, louder this time, because the explosive force is channeled through tunnels. Smoke pours from the main entrance of the pillbox complex. A steel door blows outward from internal pressure. The machine gun in the second pillbox stops. The third pillbox continues firing. Garza has 3 rounds left. He repositions, crawling 20 yards under fire to get an angle on a third shaft. Rivera follows, dragging the ammunition pack through volcanic gravel. Garza aims, fires. The round clips the edge of the shaft and detonates on the surface. No penetration. 2 rounds left. Fourth shot. Direct entry into the shaft. Underground detonation. Silence from the third pillbox. Marines from 2nd Platoon assault Baker 7, 4 minutes later. They find 17 Japanese soldiers dead inside the tunnel complex. The copper jets from 3 M6A3 rounds detonating in enclosed underground passages had turned the Japanese defenders' greatest advantage into their tomb. The tunnels that protected them from bombs and artillery had channeled shaped charge fragments through every connected chamber. Garza's improvised technique spreads through Marine units within days. By March 10th, bazooka teams across Iwo Jima are hunting ventilation shafts, tunnel openings, and firing slits instead of looking for tanks. The M6A3's penetration against fortifications jumps from 14% effectiveness to 53% when used against tunnel ventilation points instead of solid walls. Total Japanese fortifications destroyed by M6A3 rounds on Iwo Jima reaches 189 by the time the island is secured on March 26th. An estimated 800 Japanese defenders killed by shaped charges used in ways the designers never imagined. The news reached Europe and the Pacific simultaneously. Units in Germany began using M6A3 rounds against fortified positions along the Siegfried Line with similar results. Shaped charges fired into bunker ventilation systems. Observation slits and doorways proved devastatingly effective in ways that direct wall penetration never achieved. By April 1945, the M6A3 had transformed from a dedicated anti-tank weapon into a multi-purpose assault tool. Infantry commanders requested double their normal allocation of M6A3 rounds, not because they expected more tanks, but because the weapon killed fortifications as effectively as it killed armor when used correctly. Production surged to 250,000 rounds per month. The copper shortage that had threatened manufacturing was partially solved by recycling captured German ammunition, melting down Panzerfaust warheads, and repurposing the copper for American M6A3 liners. There was a poetic justice in that. German copper killing German positions. The overall impact on the war became measurable in human lives. Statistical analysis conducted by the Army after the war estimated that M6A3 rounds used against both armor and fortifications between December 1944 and August 1945 directly saved approximately 4,700 American lives that would have been lost in conventional assaults against the same targets. 4,700 families that received letters saying your son is coming home instead of we regret to inform you. German morale reports captured after the war revealed that by April 1945, armored units on the Western Front operated at 62% of authorized strength, with crews refusing to advance into areas where infantry anti-tank weapons had been reported. Japanese prisoners taken on Okinawa, where the M6A3 saw extensive use beginning April 1st, reported that shaped charge attacks on tunnel systems caused more psychological terror than naval bombardment, because there was nowhere underground that felt safe anymore. Captain Lawrence Chen received the Legion of Merit in May 1945 for his work improving M6A3, reliability and developing field training programs. Sergeant Thomas Garza received the Navy Cross for the assault on Baker 7. His citation described extraordinary heroism and tactical innovation under fire. Garza kept the citation in a drawer and never showed it to anyone until his daughter found it in 1987. Sergeant Jim Morrison, still fighting in Germany, added 4 more tank kills to his record by April. His bazooka tube carried 8 small marks scratched into the metal with a bayonet tip, 1 for each panzer. He stopped counting after crossing the Rhine because killing had become routine, and routine killing bothered him in ways he could not explain to anyone who was not there. The M6A3 had changed the war. It had given infantry power they never possessed before. It had forced the most powerful armored force in history to retreat from foot soldiers carrying tubes. It had turned volcanic tunnels into death traps and concrete bunkers into coffins. But every weapon has a story that extends beyond the battlefield. Every invention carries consequences that outlast the war it was built for. And the men who carried M6A3 rounds through frozen forests and volcanic beaches carried something else home with them. Something that no amount of copper and explosive could fix. In Part 4, we will see what happened after the guns went silent. The classified secrets that kept veterans quiet for 30 years. The Cold War legacy that turned a World War II rocket into the ancestor of every modern anti-tank weapon. And the human cost that statistics never capture the men who survived the war, but never escaped what they saw inside those tanks and tunnels. Because this story has one more chapter, and it is the one that matters most. A copper cone machined to 1/1000th of an inch. A nose cone that crumpled at exactly 4.7 inches. A jet that moved at 25,000 feet per second. That was what American engineers built. 2 dead panzers in 90 seconds outside Bastogne. That was what Sergeant Jim Morrison proved. A foam-lined box that turned a 12% failure rate into less than 3. That was what Captain Lawrence Chen delivered. 189 Japanese fortifications destroyed on Iwo Jima by a weapon never designed to fight concrete. That was what Sergeant Thomas Garza improvised. The M6A3 changed the war. It gave infantry the power to kill tanks, shatter bunkers, and collapse tunnel networks. It saved an estimated 4,700 American lives. It forced the most powerful armored force in history to retreat from soldiers carrying tubes. But every weapon has an after. Every war has a silence that follows the last shot. And the men who carried M6A3 rounds through frozen forests and across volcanic beaches carried something else home that no one talked about in 1945. This is where the story takes its final turn. And it is not the turn anyone expected. Sergeant Jim Morrison, mustered out of the Army in November 1945 with a Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and 8 Panzer kills scratched into a bazooka tube he was not allowed to keep. The Army confiscated the tube at the separation center because the M6A3 program remained classified. They took his weapon, his ammunition records, and the technical manual he had carried since that morning outside Bastogne. They handed him discharge papers and told him not to discuss the details of his anti-tank operations with anyone. National security. Morrison returned to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He got a job at a meatpacking plant on the east side of town. He married Dorothy Elkins in June 1947. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He worked at that plant for 37 years, retiring in 1982 as a floor supervisor. He never talked about the war. Not at family dinners. Not at the VFW hall, where other veterans swapped stories over cheap beer. Not when his oldest son asked about the medals in the dresser drawer. Morrison kept his silence for 42 years because the Army told him to, and because some silences protect the people keeping them. What Morrison carried home did not have a name in 1945. Doctors called it combat fatigue and prescribed rest. His wife called it moods and learned when to leave him alone. His children called it Dad being quiet and accepted it the way children accept things they cannot understand. We call it PTSD now, but the name came decades too late for the men who needed it most. In 1987, Morrison's grandson asked him for a high school history project interview. Morrison was 66 years old. Something broke open that afternoon. He described the December morning outside Bastogne in detail he had never shared with anyone. The fog, the sound of tank tracks, the way his hands shook. He described watching a 19-year-old German crew member burn alive on frozen ground and choosing not to look at the boy's face. He described the smell inside the 1st Panzer when he peered through the commander's hatch. Then he said something his grandson recorded on a cassette tape that his family still has. "Don't ever let anyone tell you war is glorious. It's just killing and then living with what you did. Those heat rounds saved my life and the lives of my buddies. But they killed men who were just doing their jobs same as me. I'm grateful for the technology, and I'm haunted by what it did." Morrison died in 2003 at 82. His family found a box in his attic containing his uniform, his Bronze Star, and a single expended M6A3 rocket casing with the nose cone crushed from impact. He had smuggled it home from Europe in 1945, hidden inside a rolled blanket, kept it for 58 years, never mentioned it to anyone. One rocket casing, the only physical evidence of the most important moment in his life. Private Eddie Kowalski. Morrison's loader, the kid from Detroit, who worked at Ford and understood machinery better than anyone in the platoon, was killed by artillery fire on January 31, 1945, near St. Vith. He was 19 years old. His body was never recovered. His name is on a memorial wall in Luxembourg, one of 5 names listed for soldiers with no known graves. He never got to tell anyone how well those heat rounds worked, never got to go back to the Ford plant, never got to grow old. Captain Lawrence Chen returned to civilian life in 1946. He took a position at Bethlehem Steel, applying the metallurgical knowledge he had used on copper liners to commercial steel production. He published 3 papers in the 1950s on explosive forming techniques derived directly from shaped charge research. None of the papers mentioned the M6A3 by designation because the technology remained classified. Chen died in 1991. His MIT alumni obituary mentioned his wartime service in one sentence without specifics. Sergeant Thomas Garza went home to El Paso and opened an auto repair shop that he ran until 1978. He kept his Navy Cross in a drawer and never showed it to anyone until his daughter found it while cleaning his house after his death in 1994. The citation described extraordinary heroism. Garza had described it to his wife once as just figuring out where to point the damn thing. But the legacy of what these men built, proved and carried into combat did not end when they came home. It was just beginning. The M6A3's shaped charge principles became the foundation of every infantry anti-tank weapon developed for the next 8 decades. The standoff nose cone concept that Aberdeen engineers perfected in 1944 appeared in the Soviet RPG-7, introduced in 1961, which used an almost identical mechanism to position its warhead at the correct distance from the target. The copper liner design influenced the American M72 law fielded in 1963 and the Swedish AT-4 that became NATO standard in the 1980s. The M20 Super Bazooka, deployed in Korea in 1951, fired a 3.5-inch rocket with a shaped charge warhead that penetrated 280 millimeters of armor, nearly 3 times the M6A3's capability, using the same 42-degree copper cone angle that Aberdeen had determined was optimal 7 years earlier. In Vietnam, American soldiers carried M72 laws that weighed less than the M6A3 but delivered shaped charge jets derived from identical physics. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the Javelin missile system used tandem-shaped charges, essentially 2 M6A3 warheads fired in sequence, the first to defeat reactive armor, and the second to penetrate the main plate beneath. The AT-4, carried by infantry units in every NATO country, still uses a copper liner collapsed by explosive detonation to form a penetrating jet at 25,000 feet per second. More than 40 nations today field infantry anti-tank weapons that trace their engineering lineage directly to the M6A3 program. The total number of armored vehicles destroyed worldwide by shaped charge infantry weapons since 1944 exceeds 14,000 confirmed kills across 23 separate conflicts. Every single one of those kills used physics first proven in a 3.4-pound rocket, fired from a tube by soldiers who had been told they could not fight tanks. The M6A3 program also influenced civilian technology in ways its designers never imagined. Shaped charge principles adapted from military research became standard tools in oil well perforation, where small explosive charges punch holes through steel well casings to allow petroleum to flow. The mining industry uses shaped charges derived from the same physics to fracture rock in controlled patterns. Demolition companies employ linear-shaped charges to cut steel beams during building demolition with surgical precision. Every time a controlled demolition drops a skyscraper straight down instead of sideways, the physics making that possible trace back to a copper cone angled at 42 degrees. But the deepest lesson of the M6A3 is not about copper or explosives or the velocity of superheated jets. It is about what happens when desperate people are given permission to try something that should not work. The engineers at Ardennes had failed 72 times before attempt 73 succeeded. They were not geniuses working in isolation. They were exhausted men under impossible pressure who kept trying because soldiers were dying, and the mathematics said a solution existed even when the engineering said it did not. They had every reason to quit after failure 40 or failure 60. Nobody would have blamed them. The problem was genuinely believed to be unsolvable within the constraints of existing bazooka technology. They solved it with a hollow steel cone that cost 12 cents to manufacture. The history of innovation, military and civilian alike, is filled with identical patterns. Solutions that seem obvious in retrospect were considered impossible by experts at the time. The British rejected radar integration into fighter command until the Battle of Britain proved it could save a nation. The Navy dismissed aircraft carriers as floating targets until Pearl Harbor demonstrated that air power had replaced battleships forever. Doctors ridiculed hand-washing as unnecessary until germ theory proved that the simplest intervention saved the most lives. The M6A3 belongs in that lineage. Not because it was the most sophisticated weapon of World War II, it was not. Not because it single-handedly won the war, it did not. But because it proved that the gap between impossible and inevitable is sometimes nothing more than one person refusing to accept that the problem cannot be solved. Morrison was a farmer who killed tanks. Chen was an engineer who saved a weapon with a foam box. Garza was a mechanic who turned a tunnel network into a graveyard. Kowalski was a factory worker who never came home. None of them were extraordinary by the standards that history usually celebrates. No West Point education, no family connections, no political influence, just ordinary men who encountered an extraordinary problem and refused to die quietly. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. In 2004, 1 year after Jim Morrison's death, his grandson, the same one who recorded that interview in 1987, donated the expended M6A3 rocket casing from Morrison's attic to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Museum archivists examined the casing and found something unexpected. Scratched into the interior surface of the rocket tube, invisible unless you knew where to look, were two sets of initials: J.M. and E.K. Jim Morrison and Eddie Kowalski. Morrison had carved both their initials into the casing of the first M6A3 round he ever fired, the round that killed Panzer No. 412 outside Bastogne on December 18, 1944. He carried that casing for 58 years, through a career at a meat packing plant, through raising 3 children, through decades of silence about what he did and what he saw. He carried his loader's initials next to his own, a private memorial to a 19-year-old kid from Detroit who never got to come home. The casing is on display today in a small case on the museum's second floor. The label reads, M6A3 HEAT rocket casing, expended December 1944, donated by family of Sergeant James Morrison, gruesome Ardennes campaign. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It is small and unremarkable next to the Sherman tanks and aircraft displays that draw the crowds. But if you lean close and look inside the tube, you can still see the initials. From a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne to every modern battlefield on Earth. From a 3.4-pound rocket to the Javelin missiles carried by soldiers in Ukraine today. From 72 failures to one success that changed the rules of ground warfare forever. The M6A3 proved that infantry does not have to be helpless, that the man in the foxhole can fight back, that technology built by ordinary engineers and carried by ordinary soldiers can overcome any advantage held by any enemy. 2.73 million rounds manufactured. 890,000 fired in combat. 4,700 lives saved. One copper cone angled at 42 degrees, and 2 sets of initials scratched into a spent rocket casing by a 23-year-old farm kid who just wanted to remember the man beside him. That is the story of the Panzer Killers. That is why it matters. And if you know someone who served in any war, in any branch carrying any weapon, tell them their story matters too. Because every piece of technology we take for granted was built by someone trying to solve a problem. And usually, it was someone just like them.